The first time the child saw the Immaterium, it came as a whisper, a tremor beneath the surface of thought that made the world shimmer and hum with impossible light. In the dim corridors of House Vale, where tapestries depicted long-dead ancestors in muted golds and blacks, the boy's third eye opened without ceremony, without warning. One moment he was tracing the pattern of a labyrinthine data slate, learning the proper sequence of cogitator arrays, and the next he was adrift in a vast, endless expanse of colors that had no name and shapes that refused definition. The visions pressed on him like tides, soft yet insistent, probing the edges of his mind. Fear wrapped itself around his heart, but there was no turning back. The house tutors, aware of the child's mutation long before he knew its meaning, moved swiftly, guiding him with hands both gentle and iron-bound. He could not speak of what he saw, for the Immaterium answers no language. When he tried, the words shattered before they left his lips, scattering like shards of glass in the silent chamber. His tutors did not falter. They whispered prayers to the Emperor, invoked rites that were half ceremony, half precaution, all of them meant to tether the child's fledgling consciousness to reality. The boy learned to breathe through the visions, to trace their currents with the careful focus of a novice star chartographer. Yet every attempt to anchor his mind left him more exhausted than the last. Nights became an intricate dance of light and shadow, his dreams a theater of impossible forms where stars collided. Without sound and corridors stretched into dimensions he could not map. Family and servants alike treated him with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Even the servants, who had seen countless strange births and curious mutations in the house, approached him with quiet reverence, speaking in soft tones that belied the tension coiled in their shoulders. Every gesture, from the lifting of a cup of water to the turning of a chair, carried the weight of scrutiny. Nothing could be allowed to startle him. A sudden sound might tear open a fissure into the Immaterium that he could not close. The boy's parents, figures of cold nobility, hovered at the edges of his world, offering comfort through ritual and presence rather than affection. He understood instinctively that he was a vessel, a conduit, and that his own desires were subordinate to a fate carved in blood and stars before he drew his first breath. Training began not with books, but with silence. The tutors instructed him to listen to the faintest vibrations in the air, to note the subtlest shimmer of light, to feel the pull of forces unseen. At first, he could only detect hints, fleeting impressions that made his stomach knot with vertigo. But with each passing day, the currents became more tangible, more insistent, guiding his thoughts along paths that he could not have chosen himself. There were moments when he glimpsed what seemed like other minds, distant yet familiar, shifting in the void, whispering secrets he could almost understand but not claim. He learned quickly that curiosity was both a gift and a trap, for reaching too far into those whispers risked tearing his own sense of self, leaving him hollow, a shell adrift in the currents of the warp. The rituals of the house were no less exacting. Morning prayers, punctuated with incense smoke and the subtle hum of sacred cogitators, were designed to focus the mind and strengthen the psychic tether. Tokens of the Emperor's favor, a medallion etched with the imperial aquila, a small reliquary containing prayers written by long-dead navigators, were pressed into his hands to remind him of the weight he carried. He learned the languages of the house, the precise cadence of verse that resonated with the Immaterium, the quiet signals between tutors, the coded gestures that allowed him to communicate without breaking the fragile membrane between mind and warp. In these early years, the line between instruction and indoctrination blurred, and the boy felt the first stirrings of isolation. Friends among other children were impossible, their conversations shallow and distracting, their laughter sometimes tearing at the fragile fabric of his focus. Yet even in this strict regimen, moments of awe persisted. The child occasionally glimpsed threads of the future, tiny ripples in the currents that suggested danger or salvation, whispers of a battle yet to come, or a fleet poised to jump through a starless void. These glimpses came unbidden, often accompanied by nausea or a piercing headache, yet they were intoxicating. They were a promise of power, a confirmation that his mutation was not a curse but a key. And in the quiet of his chamber, under the watchful gaze of statues depicting navigators of centuries past, the boy felt the first stirring of purpose. He understood, in a way that no one could explain, that his life was already entwined with the survival of the Imperium itself. The first time he attempted to chart a course through the currents on his own, it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He sat before a miniature holomap, the stars reduced to points of light, and felt the pull of the Immaterium through his veins. Tentatively, he reached with his mind, touching the currents as though they were strings, and the room around him fell away. For a fleeting moment, he was not in House Vale but suspended between stars, seeing the glow of distant suns reflected in the wake of an unseen fleet. And then, just as abruptly, he returned, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. The tutors nodded silently, neither congratulating nor scolding, only acknowledging that the first spark of true comprehension had been kindled. He was a child still, yet the weight of countless worlds pressed upon his small shoulders. The visions would not cease, nor would the whispers of the Immaterium, and in that relentless, breathtaking solitude, he learned the first lesson that would define his life. To see beyond the stars is to bear their burdens, and to carry their knowledge is to be alone, forever walking a path that no ordinary soul could follow. The boy's days became a rhythm of light and shadow, of preparation and trial. Every action was measured, every gesture scrutinized, for the Immaterium responded not only to thought but to intent. A slight hesitation in the hand, a flicker of doubt in the mind could ripple outward, producing distortions that were invisible to all but him. The tutors emphasized control, patience, and the meticulous recording of every impression, every sensation. Data slates etched with painstaking precision became both journal and map, capturing the currents of his perception. To the outside world, these were innocuous exercises, a child learning discipline. But within the confines of his mind, each entry was a lifeline, a tether to the reality he could so easily lose. Sleep offered no reprieve. In the darkness, the Immaterium pressed close, brushing against the borders of his mind with whispers and flickering visions. Sometimes these were fleeting, a wave of heat, a shimmer of color, a hint of movement that vanished before recognition. At other times, the images were so vivid that he could almost feel the pull of a fleet, the shudder of an engine spine, or the echo of a distant battle. There were nights when he awoke screaming, only to find that no one had disturbed him. The Immaterium itself had intruded into his dreams, testing, probing, beckoning him forward. And yet, despite the terror, he craved it, hungering for the connection that promised knowledge and glimpses of the vast, unfathomable Imperium he was meant to serve. Within the household, the boy's emergence into awareness drew attention, both protective and wary. The elder Navigators, visiting from distant spires and noble houses, observed him with quiet intensity, their eyes mirrors of experience and caution. They offered subtle guidance, small demonstrations of technique, or cryptic advice meant to shape his understanding without overwhelming his fledgling senses. From them, he learned that every navigator was both a child of destiny and a guardian of secrets, that their value lay not in strength or weaponry, but in perception and restraint. He understood, though no one said it aloud, that his life would always balance on a knife's edge between insight and madness, between service and destruction. The rituals of induction became more intricate as his abilities matured. The boy was led to chambers lined with prismatic lenses, reflecting and refracting light in patterns designed to train his ocular sensitivity. He learned to trace currents across these shifting prisms, noting how the Immaterium's whispers echoed in the corridors of his mind. Each failure elicited a quiet correction, a touch of the hand, a murmur of guidance, reinforcing the principle that mistakes could be fatal, but that perseverance was rewarded with clarity. The exercises were grueling, but in them, he glimpsed the first fragments of what it meant to guide humanity across the stars. A responsibility both sacred and perilous, a burden that required mastery of self above all else. Friendship remained elusive, though not entirely absent. A single servant, an older woman named Lareth, became a quiet presence at his side. She did not speak of the currents, nor did she question the visions, but she offered consistency, the smell of oil and incense in the morning, a gentle hand on his shoulder when the weight of the day pressed too heavily, a quiet song that carried the resonance of a mortal world. These small touches reminded him that life outside the Immaterium existed, that he was not wholly consumed by the visions, and that there was a fragile thread connecting him to the human world he might one day guide. His parents' presence remained formal, yet the weight of their expectations was clear. Every movement, every utterance was measured against the potential he represented. Failures were corrected without malice, victories noted without overt celebration, as though even praise might unbalance the delicate equilibrium of his developing mind. The boy internalized these lessons, learning to measure his own desires against the imperatives of House Vael, of the Emperor, and of the unseen currents that pulled through the warp. He began to perceive the subtle interplay of politics, duty, and perception that shaped the lives of navigators long before birth and long after death. And always, there were the whispers. Sometimes they were nothing more than the echo of his own thoughts amplified through the Immaterium. Other times they were voices with texture, with intent, slipping past the edges of his consciousness. He could not understand them, could not decipher whether they were warnings, guidance, or mere echoes of forces indifferent to humanity. But he learned to listen without surrender, to respond with caution, and to trust in his instincts while acknowledging that the true currents of the warp were far vaster and older than any human mind. The boy's third eye had opened, and with it came both the first taste of freedom and the first brush with isolation, the knowledge that to see beyond the stars was to be bound to them in a way few mortals could ever comprehend. By the time the boy's 12th year approached, the foundation of his existence had shifted irreversibly. Childhood had become a training ground not for play but for vigilance. Imagination had become a tool for survival rather than diversion. He moved through the halls of House Vile with a measured gait, every step conscious, every glance aware of the unseen. His tutors watched, not as guardians but as examiners of a fragile, unfolding prodigy, testing the limits of perception and endurance. The lessons were relentless, often leaving him drained, yet each day he felt the Immaterium grow more familiar, more tangible, as if the currents themselves had recognized him and were beginning to bend around his presence. There were moments of wonder that pierced the constant discipline. He discovered that he could sense the pull of distant stars, faint but insistent, a rhythm in the void that seemed to beckon him toward them. Sometimes, during the quiet hours before dawn, he would trace these currents with a trembling hand, noting patterns that hinted at dangers or opportunities far beyond the limits of any mortal fleet. The beauty was both intoxicating and terrifying, a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes that suggested not creation but calculation, not life but design. And yet the boy understood instinctively that this knowledge was both a gift and a chain, binding him to a path he could not refuse. Isolation had become both companion and adversary. Other children, even distant cousins within the house, were kept at bay, their presence a potential disruption to his fragile focus. He learned to find solace in the minutiae of his training. The hum of servitors in the halls, the rhythmic clatter of cogitator relays, the faint scent of burning incense mixing with the metallic tang of machinery. These small anchors tethered him to the mortal world, even as his consciousness expanded into the Immaterium. The balance was precarious, and he knew instinctively that a misstep could leave him adrift. A mind lost between two realms, neither fully human nor fully warp. The first time he attempted a controlled projection into the currents alone, without the guidance of a tutor, he felt a thrill unlike any he had known. He focused, letting the world around him fade, and reached into the Immaterium with the careful precision of one threading a needle through unseen fabric. For a moment the boundaries dissolved, and he felt the pulse of distant fleets, the sway of interstellar tides, the faint echo of battles being fought in starless voids. The experience left him trembling, both exhilarated and terrified, for he realized the magnitude of what he was capable of, and the fragility of the tether that kept him anchored to reality. Ritual and duty remained inseparable. Each day began with prayer, each night ended with reflection. Tokens of the Emperor, ancient and sacred, were pressed into his hands, their weight symbolic and literal. He learned the proper handling of sacred texts, the incantations that harmonized with the Immaterium's subtle rhythms, the gestures that allowed him to communicate without speaking. These were not mere exercises in obedience. They were survival mechanisms, reinforcing the structure required to navigate forces beyond comprehension. Through them, he learned that discipline and devotion were not optional, but essential for both the self and the Imperium. The whispers grew more complex as his understanding deepened. No longer merely echoes at the edge of perception, they became layered, intricate, sometimes contradictory. The boy learned to filter, to interpret, to respect the limits of his comprehension. He discovered the first inkling of the moral weight carried by navigators, that knowledge could guide or mislead, protect or destroy, depending on the clarity and intent of the mind that wielded it. This realization brought with it a solemnity that no child should bear, yet it was inescapable. He was not merely a student. He was a sentinel, standing at the threshold between human civilization and the infinite, indifferent currents of the warp. By the end of that formative year, the boy had glimpsed the scope of his destiny. He understood that his life was not merely his own, but an instrument of the Emperor's will, a key that could unlock safe passage through the void or doom an entire fleet. And though the burden was immense, there was also a singular clarity. The Immaterium had chosen him, and in accepting it, he had accepted the isolation, the vigilance, and the solemn responsibility that came with sight beyond mortal perception. The house, the tutors, the rituals, all of it had forged the first true navigator, though the path ahead was only beginning, fraught with peril, wonder, and the unending currents that would forever define his life. And so the child, now no longer fully child but not yet fully master, prepared to step further into the unseen, to meet the currents on their terms, to take the first tentative steps toward guiding humanity through darkness that even the stars dared not illuminate. The whispers followed, patient, eternal, a promise of vision and a warning of solitude. The boy was ready, or as ready as any mortal could ever hope to be, born to see, burdened to lead, and destined to navigate the Imperium in a world where the unseen held all the power. The first time the boy stepped aboard a void ship, he understood immediately that the world he had known, the disciplined halls of House Vale, the prismatic chambers of his training, was only a preparation. The void ship was immense beyond comprehension, a living cathedral of steel and promethium, where engines groaned like ancient beasts and corridors twisted in ways that defied simple geometry. Servitors moved in synchronized precision, their joints squealing with exertion, while Skitarii patrols maintained a constant vigilance, their augmented eyes scanning for dangers both internal and external. Here, the Immaterium was no longer a distant whisper. It pressed against the vessel itself, bending perception, tugging at the edges of reality, and demanding obedience with every pulse of its currents. The boy, now young but already marked by his abilities, felt the first real weight of responsibility. The bridge, a lattice of transparent armor and humming consoles, allowed glimpses of the stars beyond and the subtle distortions of the warp around the ship. Navigators of greater experience sat in their stations, eyes half closed in trance, hands poised above arrays of levers and data slates, translating sight into trajectory, intuition into life-saving command. He observed, fascinated and terrified, the delicate choreography of human and machine, mind and Immaterium. Every decision was a negotiation with unseen forces. Every command carried the potential to preserve or annihilate. He quickly learned that training aboard the void ship was unlike anything the house had offered. Discipline was absolute, and failure was not a matter of reprimand but survival. Each day began with exercises designed to attune the body and mind to the ship's rhythms, the vibration of engine spines, the subtle warp-induced oscillations in the hull, the faint hum of psychic feedback through the air itself. Tutors, older navigators who had guided fleets across the void for decades, offered instruction in both technique and endurance. They pushed him to expand his perceptions, to sense not only the immediate currents, but the faintest ripples that might indicate the presence of anomalies, predators, or warp storms. Mistakes could be invisible to others, yet catastrophic in outcome. Life aboard the vessel was a relentless interplay of noise, motion, and tension. The smell of promethium, acrid and metallic, mingled with the scent of oiled machinery and incense used to focus the minds of the crew. Data slates clicked and whirred, vox grills crackled with updates, and the constant vibration of engines created a background hum that pressed against the senses. Sleep was regimented and scarce. The boy learned to rest with one part of his mind still reaching into the Immaterium, monitoring the faint eddies of power, listening for the subtle warnings hidden in its murmur. Isolation persisted, though now it was compounded by the physical separation from the familiar halls of his home. Friends were absent, and conversation with others was limited to the precise, clipped exchanges required for survival. Yet in this environment, the boy began to experience a new form of mastery. He learned to trace the pull of the currents as they wrapped around the hull, to anticipate shifts before they became threatening, and to feel the latent energy of distant stellar phenomena. The Immaterium was no longer a chaotic tempest to fear. It was a river with currents that could be read, a language to be interpreted, a dance to be learned. His vision sharpened, his reflexes became attuned to imperceptible oscillations, and his confidence, though tempered with caution, grew with each successful exercise. Every day reinforced the delicate truth that a navigator's skill was measured not by knowledge alone, but by the ability to act under immense, unyielding pressure. Political and social pressures also became evident. The boy observed the subtle hierarchies among crew and tutors, the quiet deference shown to senior navigators, the veiled tensions between houses, the constant awareness of reputation and legacy. Every gesture, every word carried meaning. Even the Skitarii and servitors were not immune to protocol, each movement a reflection of the vast machinery of the Imperium's discipline. He began to grasp that mastery over the currents was only part of the challenge. Understanding human nature, ambition, and rivalry was equally vital. Missteps here could unravel not just a course but the cohesion of an entire fleet. The first real jump through the warp came without warning. The vessel shuddered as engines roared, the air thickened, and the stars outside stretched and bent, then vanished into a molten swirl of color and heat. Panic would have been natural, but the boy's training held him firm. He focused on the currents, reaching into their folds, feeling for the channels carved by previous navigators, guided by intuition and instinct honed through years of preparation. Hours, or was it minutes, passed in a blur of perception, each decision instantaneous yet deliberate. The ship emerged intact, stars returning to view, hull integrity uncompromised, and the boy felt a surge of exhilaration tempered by the knowledge of how close disaster had always been. From that moment, life aboard the void ship became a crucible. Every day brought exercises in precision, perception, and endurance. The Immaterium, once a distant and terrifying expanse, was now the medium through which his destiny would unfold, demanding constant vigilance, insight, and courage. The boy had moved from the sheltered halls of House Vile to a realm where skill determined survival, and each journey across the void taught lessons no tutor or ritual could impart. That to navigate the warp was to confront both the cosmos and oneself, to wrest order from chaos while remaining tethered to humanity. The boy's understanding of the void deepened with each passing day. He discovered that the Immaterium was not uniform. It had moods, rhythms, and subtle eddies that could either guide or mislead. Some currents pulsed with a faint, almost musical resonance, promising swift travel, while others twisted unpredictably, hiding dangers that could rend ships and minds alike. The tutors instructed him in recognizing these patterns, but experience was the only true teacher. Every miscalculation, every hesitation, became a lesson etched into memory, sometimes painfully, sometimes with the quiet satisfaction of mastery achieved. As his skill grew, the boy began to understand the psychological toll exacted by the void. The currents were not merely external, they intertwined with the mind itself. Time lost all meaning in the Immaterium, days stretching into subjective eternities, nights folding in upon themselves. A navigator could emerge from a single jump exhausted not only physically but mentally, the effort of maintaining perception and control leaving faint scars on cognition. The boy learned to meditate within this pressure, to ground his thoughts with ritual, to whisper prayers to the Emperor while his consciousness wandered the currents. These small anchors preserved sanity, though he understood they were fragile, and that the line between insight and madness could shift in an instant. Interaction with the crew reinforced the boy's lessons in humility and vigilance. Officers relied upon him, sometimes unknowingly, for decisions that could decide the fate of entire convoys. Astropaths communicated with cryptic urgency, their voices a link between the navigator's sight and the fleets dependent upon it. Skitarii, augmented with cybernetic precision, observed the boy with respect tempered by the instinctive suspicion that all things psychic engender. Every exchange was a lesson in responsibility. A navigator could not act alone, yet too much reliance on others could be a liability. He had to become both conduit and solitary sentinel, balancing collaboration with the cold solitude that his perception demanded. The physical demands of life aboard the void ship were no less punishing. Narrow corridors, towering engine spines, and the constant vibration of the vessel tested endurance. And long periods of stillness at the navigator's throne required muscles to remain taut, while the mind wandered far beyond the hull. Meals were sparse and functional, the taste of rations punctuated by the acrid tang of recycled air. Yet even these hardships were instructive, teaching focus, patience, and the discipline of body and mind that would become inseparable from perception. The boy learned to welcome discomfort, to embrace the monotony of duty as a means of sharpening his senses, and to perceive the smallest irregularities in environment and vessel alike. The first extended voyage through contested space marked a turning point. Signals from distant worlds, warnings of warp turbulence, and the faint tremor of unseen foes pressed against the ship. The boy was thrust into real decisions, having to adjust course, calibrate arrays, and interpret the subtle shifts in currents that could spell life or annihilation. Each maneuver demanded instantaneous judgment, the merging of instinct, training, and perception. For the first time, he understood that the theories and exercises of House Vale were merely scaffolding. The reality of warp travel was unrelenting, demanding mastery that left no room for hesitation or error. Within this crucible, the boy's senses sharpened beyond ordinary comprehension. He could feel the tug of distant stars, perceive the slight turbulence of the Immaterium around massive fleets, and even sense the faint, ghostly residue of past jumps in nearby regions of space. These were subtle phenomena, easily overlooked by those untrained, but to him they formed a map, a living chart of risk and opportunity, danger and safe passage. His mind, once fragile and reactive, began to anticipate the currents, predicting how they would fold and flow, almost as if the Immaterium itself had begun to acknowledge him as a navigator rather than an intruder. Despite the growing mastery, the boy was never allowed complacency. Every exercise ended with reflection, assessment, and often critique. Tutors drilled him on the minutiae, the exact calibration of helm arrays, the subtle changes in psychic resonance, the timing of micro-adjustments that preserved the vessel's integrity. Mistakes, even small ones, were dissected with unrelenting precision, teaching him humility and reinforcing the delicate balance between control and surrender. The Immaterium was patient in its own way, but it demanded vigilance. Those who failed were remembered in hushed tones or, worse, vanished from history without record. By the close of this stage, the boy had begun to internalize a crucial truth. The void ship was not merely a vessel, it was an extension of the navigator's mind and he of it. Every thrum of engine, every whisper of warp current, every breath of recycled air was connected, a symbiotic system where perception dictated survival. To navigate successfully was to merge intellect, instinct, and will into a single focus to act as both conduit and guardian, and to recognize that failure was not merely loss, it was annihilation on a scale that could ripple across star systems. He had left the sheltered corridors of House Vale behind and entered a realm where the Immaterium was both teacher and judge, a world of beauty and terror beyond mortal comprehension, where every step, every glance, and every decision carried consequences as vast as the stars themselves. The boy's integration into the rhythm of the void ship reached a delicate equilibrium. He no longer simply reacted to the currents, he anticipated them, moving through their subtle undulations with a grace that belied his youth. Each jump through the warp became a meditation, a merging of mind, vessel, and Immaterium. Yet mastery was never complete. The currents were alive, unpredictable, and infinite. There were moments when the stars themselves seemed to shudder, and the ship trembled as if aware of the stakes at hand. In those times, the boy felt the full weight of the responsibility he carried, knowing that entire convoys, entire worlds, might depend on his ability to see and to act without hesitation. The tutors continued their relentless oversight, pushing him toward precision he had once thought unattainable. They reminded him, subtly yet insistently, that skill alone was insufficient. Discipline, vigilance, and the unflinching acknowledgement of mortality were equally necessary. In private, older navigators offered fragments of advice, cryptic warnings, stories of perilous jumps, glimpses of errors that had shattered lesser minds. From them, the boy learned the tenuous line between perception and arrogance, between insight and hubris. Every lesson reinforced the unspoken truth that the Immaterium could not be conquered. It could only be understood enough to navigate safely. The whispers persisted, patient and eternal, a constant reminder that the currents were not merely obstacles but sentient, observing and negotiating forces. The boy had begun to step fully into his role, a mediator between worlds, a negotiator with shadows and a sentinel for the Imperium, standing between human folly and the infinite, indifferent expanse of the warp. The boy's understanding of the Immaterium deepened with experience, revealing its layers of subtlety, threat, and occasional mercy. Not all whispers were warnings. Some offered guidance, though it was always partial, fractured, and shrouded in ambiguity. He learned to read the difference, to sense when a presence sought cooperation, when it merely observed, and when it was indifferent or malevolent. These distinctions were vital, for a navigator's success relied not only on skill or courage, but on the ability to interpret the Immaterium's nuanced signals and act without hesitation. Each decision, each gesture of the mind, became a negotiation, a delicate exchange that could ripple outward to affect thousands of lives. Rituals grew more complex. The boy's hands traced sacred geometries across hollow displays, tokens of the Emperor placed strategically to maintain psychic stability, while whispered prayers harmonized with the subtle vibrations of the warp. The combination of training, instinct, and ritual allowed him to interact with entities he could neither see nor name, feeling their presence, their weight, and sometimes the faint echo of intent. The Immaterium responded not with language, but with resonance, emotion, and pressure, and he learned to translate that into actionable insight. One misstep, a flicker of arrogance, a lapse of concentration could be catastrophic. He knew that every decision aboard the void ship, every maneuver in warp space, might hinge upon these fleeting impressions. The boy also began to recognize that power came with political and social dimensions. Senior navigators monitored his responses to unseen pressures as much as his technical skill, noting whether he approached the Immaterium with humility or hubris. Officers aboard the ship, too, watched closely, measuring his composure under duress, his ability to translate insight into action, and his awareness of human and mechanical systems alike. To be a navigator was not merely to commune with the warp. It was to balance perception, diplomacy, and subtlety in a realm where the cost of error was measured in lives, fleets, and entire worlds. One evening, as the void ship threaded its way past a fragmented star system, the boy experienced an unusual ripple, a distortion that hinted at both opportunity and danger. The currents pulled and twisted, and for a heartbeat, the Immaterium seemed to surge in conscious awareness, testing his resolve. He responded with patience and precision, invoking ritual, stabilizing tokens, and attuning his mind to the current's subtle flow. The sensation passed, leaving him shaken but intact. In its wake, he sensed fragments of futures, glimpses of paths the fleet might take, yet all were uncertain, incomplete. This was the reality of negotiation with shadows. Guidance was never total, control never absolute, and even success demanded humility and restraint. Isolation remained an ever-present companion. The boy observed that even among experienced navigators, communion with the Immaterium was a solitary endeavor. No mortal could fully share the burden of perception, the weight of insight, or the risk inherent in misjudging currents and entities alike. Nights were spent in meditation, reflection, or private communion, the silence of the void ship amplifying the subtle pressures of the warp. Sleep was careful and measured, a half-rest that allowed the mind to remain attuned, to continue listening even when consciousness withdrew. Loneliness became both tool and torment, sharpening the boy's focus while emphasizing the separation that marked his kind. In parallel, he observed the consequences of inattention. Other navigators, older and more confident, occasionally revealed the price of hubris, a subtle lapse, a failure to notice a faint eddy, a misreading of whispers. Small mistakes left uncorrected could escalate, resulting in a vessel delayed, damaged, or lost entirely. These examples were neither punishment nor spectacle. They were lessons etched in silence, reminders of the razor-thin margin that separated competence from disaster. The boy internalized these warnings, letting them sharpen instinct, deepen vigilance, and cultivate the respect owed to the Immaterium's sentience. By the end of this phase, he had begun to understand his place in the intricate web of forces. The void ship was no longer merely a vessel. It was a locus of interaction between mortal skill and immortal currents, a crucible where perception, discipline, and courage were tested continuously. His mind, trained to sense the faintest perturbations, had become a bridge between worlds, able to mediate, negotiate, and respond in ways that few could comprehend. He was beginning to step fully into the role of a navigator, not simply as a conduit of sight, but as a mediator between the imperatives of the Imperium and the shifting, often inscrutable will of the warp. The currents whispered ceaselessly, carrying both warning and promise. They had become companions, adversaries, and teachers, their presence both invisible and undeniable. The boy understood that his journey had only just begun, that every maneuver, every decision, every communion with these entities would test skill, patience, and morality. Yet he also felt the first glimmers of mastery, the ability to discern patterns, anticipate risks, and guide not only the vessel, but the lives of all who depended upon it. Within the shadows of the warp, he had begun to carve a path, delicate and precise, where intuition and discipline intersected with survival. The boy's trials deepened as the void ship ventured into more dangerous regions, where the currents of the Immaterium were turbulent and unpredictable. He had long understood that the warp was a place of indifference, yet in these regions, that indifference became an active threat, bending perception, twisting reality, and testing the limits of his skill. The whispers grew louder, sharper, sometimes almost tangible, brushing against the edges of thought and memory. He learned to meet them not with fear, but with disciplined attention, acknowledging their presence while maintaining absolute control over his mind. Each encounter was a negotiation, a silent exchange in which insight was gained. Yet humility was demanded. The first true test came when the void ship passed near a dead star whose psychic resonance had destabilized the local currents. The engines groaned, servitors shuddered, and the hull thrummed with energy that seemed almost alive. The boy's perception expanded, feeling threads of power that reached from the star, interwoven with echoes of lost vessels and the faint residues of navigators long dead. He traced these threads carefully, avoiding the eddies that threatened to twist the ship's course into catastrophic disarray. The vessel moved as though guided by invisible hands, and for a moment, the boy felt a rare clarity. That skill, training, and respect for the currents could tame even the wildest segments of the Immaterium. Yet the triumph was tempered by the awareness that a single misjudgment could undo hours or lifetimes of preparation. Interaction with older navigators became crucial. They did not merely observe him. They tested him, sometimes by subtle manipulation of currents, sometimes through psychological pressure, challenging his capacity to maintain composure under duress. Lessons were given in silence or in cryptic phrases, their meanings layered and deliberate. The boy learned to anticipate these tests, to read intent beneath words and gestures, to reconcile human behavior with the inscrutable logic of the warp. Through these exercises, he discovered the duality of a navigator's existence. Mastery of the Immaterium was inseparable from mastery of perception, temperament, and subtle diplomacy. A lapse in judgment among humans could be as lethal as a miscalculation in the warp. As the boy's skill matured, he began to glimpse the vast implications of his role. The currents were not merely physical pathways. They were conduits of possibility, carrying echoes of choices yet to be made, resonances of events both distant and imminent. The boy sensed the fragile interconnection between worlds, fleets, and the fate of the Imperium itself. He understood that every decision he made, every subtle adjustment to the vessel's course, could ripple outward with consequences far beyond his immediate perception. The realization weighed heavily, a constant reminder of the stakes inherent in his abilities. The psychological strain was relentless. Nights offered little respite, and the constant presence of the Immaterium in perception left him fatigued yet alert. He learned to compartmentalize, to anchor thought through ritual, to meditate upon the Emperor's guidance, while engaging with the unpredictable consciousness of the warp. Each session of communion left traces in the mind, faint impressions of entities, residual glimpses of currents, or faint echoes of futures that might or might not come to pass. These fragments were never complete, never fully reliable, yet they became a part of his understanding, informing judgment, guiding intuition, and shaping decisions that could not rely solely on reason or training. The boy's perception of time itself had begun to shift. Within the Immaterium, minutes could stretch into subjective eternities, hours collapsing into fleeting moments. Events in the material universe sometimes arrived unannounced, their timing dislocated from the boy's experience. He learned to rely upon instinct, habit, and subtle signs, developing an almost preternatural sense of the vessel's position, the current's flow, and the potential hazards lurking beyond perception. This intuition, honed through isolation and discipline, became as essential as any ritual, any calculation, any data slate. By the end of this phase, the boy had become a navigator not in theory but in essence. He could commune with the Immaterium, negotiate with its subtle presences, and guide the void ship through currents that would have unnerved even the most seasoned pilots. Yet mastery was never complete. Every journey, every whisper, every unseen eddy carried potential peril. The boy understood that his role demanded constant vigilance, moral clarity, and the acceptance of profound solitude. He was a mediator, a sentinel and a negotiator with shadows whose motives were inscrutable, yet whose guidance was indispensable. Emerging from these trials, he felt the first inkling of destiny beyond the immediate void. The currents hinted at patterns, at forces that shaped the Imperium's course, and perhaps even at mysteries surrounding the Emperor's unseen will. He sensed that the path ahead would demand not only skill and vigilance, but courage, insight, and perhaps the willingness to confront questions for which no mortal answer could suffice. The boy had negotiated with shadows, endured the Immaterium's tests, and survived its subtle manipulations. Ahead lay challenges grander still, where the stakes would stretch from fleets to worlds, and where perception would become both a weapon and a burden. With years of training, trial, and communion behind him, the boy, now a young navigator, began to perceive the void not merely as a challenge to be survived, but as a medium through which the Imperium itself might be guided. The currents of the Immaterium no longer whispered only warnings. They began to convey patterns, faint yet persistent, that hinted at larger flows of energy, the hidden rhythms that connected star systems, fleets, and worlds in ways that mortal understanding could scarcely capture. Each jump, each maneuver, was a brushstroke in a canvas of infinite scale, and he felt the weight of a responsibility that expanded far beyond the immediate vessel. The void ship had become an extension of his perception, a physical and psychic instrument attuned to the subtle intricacies of the Immaterium. He could trace the faint eddies left by distant fleets, sense the tremors of warp storms forming across light years, and anticipate the hidden currents that would carry convoys safely, or leave them stranded. The experience was intoxicating yet daunting, for the more he perceived, the more fragile and contingent the universe seemed. He recognized that every human choice, every fleet movement, every misjudgment in distant systems could reverberate, creating ripples that would intersect with his own decisions in ways impossible to predict. Fleet maneuvers became exercises in symphony, each vessel an instrument guided by the conductor that was his perception. Captains deferred to him not merely for navigation, but for survival, understanding that the warp, like an invisible river, could destroy or deliver based on his interpretation and control. He learned to harmonize instinct with calculation, to trust intuition while verifying with instruments, and to balance the immediacy of danger with the abstraction of distant consequences. It was a new kind of awareness, one that demanded simultaneous attention to both detail and panorama, to both motion and stillness, to both flesh and Immaterium. Isolation deepened as perception expanded. While officers and crew recognized his skill and relied on his insight, none could share the burden of vision. Even conversations carried risk. A careless word or misstep could distract him from currents imperceptible to all others, and a lapse could endanger lives across light years. Nights were spent in meditation and reflection, the mind scanning past, present, and potential futures simultaneously, attuned to patterns invisible to those around him. He became accustomed to solitude, but also to the strange exhilaration that accompanied the realization that his sight extended beyond the mortal, that he could glimpse possibilities before they materialized, and that in this perception lay both power and peril. The Immaterium itself seemed to acknowledge his presence. Currents responded with subtle shifts, eddies forming in anticipation of his thought, disturbances smoothing as if respecting his focus. The boy realized that mastery required more than instinct or calculation. It demanded a dialogue with the warp, a mutual recognition that he would act with care, patience, and attention. The whispers, once cryptic and threatening, became instruments of guidance, layering nuance atop perception. Yet even as he learned to interpret them, he remained aware that the Immaterium was indifferent, capable of twisting perception or punishing overreach in ways impossible to anticipate. Political and strategic considerations intensified alongside psychic awareness. As his reputation grew among the crew and officers, he understood that navigators were not only guides, but also mediators of trust and authority. Commanders relied on his judgment, yet they also observed, tested, and subtly influenced decisions. He began to perceive the hidden currents of human ambition, rivalry, and caution, recognizing that these social eddies were as vital to survival as any warp current. A navigator's sight extended beyond the stars, but it also encompassed the hearts and motives of those who acted upon his guidance. For human error could unravel even the most precise calculation of the Immaterium. In moments of stillness, the boy contemplated the broader consequences of his role. He glimpsed distant fleets navigating the void, convoys threading through warp storms, and signals of worlds under siege. The Immaterium was vast, but so too was the chain of cause and effect linking his decisions to outcomes both immediate and centuries removed. He felt the weight of responsibility, not as abstract philosophy, but as a tangible living burden, one that pressed upon mind, spirit, and body. Every choice was amplified, every correction reverberated, every success was contingent upon precision, tempered by foresight. By the end of this phase, the young navigator had begun to achieve a form of vision that extended far beyond ordinary perception. He could sense hidden dangers, anticipate the movement of distant fleets, and trace patterns invisible to all others. Yet with this expansion came the knowledge that perception alone could never ensure safety. Judgment, discipline, and restraint were equally critical. The path ahead would demand insight not only into the warp, but into the hearts of those whose lives depended on his guidance. The boy had become an eye beyond the stars, a sentinel whose vision would shape the course of fleets, worlds, and the Imperium itself, though always tempered by the impermanence and unpredictability of the currents he commanded. With perception expanded to encompass entire convoys and the subtle interplay of warp currents across vast distances, the young navigator began to confront the true scale of the Imperium's fragility. He sensed corridors of the Immaterium where countless ships had passed, some emerging whole, others reduced to fragments, and he understood that each path through the warp was not merely a route, but a negotiation with the unseen. Even the smallest miscalculation could leave an entire fleet stranded in a maelstrom of psychic turbulence, drifting until hulls fractured and lives were lost. The responsibility pressed upon him like a tangible weight, a burden that grew heavier with every new journey, yet one he bore with measured determination. The void ship itself became an extension of his consciousness, responding to the faintest modulation of thought. Subtle shifts in the helm arrays, minor fluctuations in warp currents, and the slight hum of the engines all provided feedback, a language that he gradually learned to read with precision. He began to anticipate eddies before they became dangerous, to sense the resonance of distant stellar phenomena, and even to detect traces of psychic interference from other navigators or entities lingering within the Immaterium. His ability to integrate sensory input, ritual discipline, and instinct transformed him from student to active agent, capable of steering both vessel and fleet through perils invisible to ordinary perception. Yet mastery of the currents was inseparable from mastery over the self. Every decision demanded calm and clarity, for emotional turbulence could disrupt perception, inviting miscalculation and disaster. Nights were spent in meditation, rituals repeated with meticulous care, hands tracing sacred geometries while prayers whispered to the Emperor anchored consciousness. Even in moments of apparent tranquility, the young navigator remained vigilant, aware that the warp never rested, that currents and whispers continued regardless of mortal fatigue. He learned to balance effort with endurance, action with patience, and insight with humility, knowing that hubris was as lethal as any warp storm. As his skill matured, he began to notice patterns in human behavior echoing those of the Immaterium itself. Officers and captains moved through the vessel with precision, their intentions intertwined with the success of navigation. Rivalries, unspoken alliances, and subtle manipulations shaped decisions in ways that paralleled the unpredictable flow of warp currents. The navigator learned to read these patterns, recognizing that human error or ambition could endanger the most carefully charted course. Danger persisted even at this scale. The Immaterium, though rich with information, remained indifferent and often hostile. Echoes of past catastrophes, spectral remnants of destroyed fleets, and the lingering malice of entities older than humanity brushed against his perception. One misstep, a distraction, a moment of hubris or misinterpretation of whispers, could unravel weeks of careful calculation, or leave vessels stranded in eddies too dangerous for mortal minds. Each decision required calibration not only of skill but of moral judgment, awareness of human frailty, and recognition of the unpredictable nature of the warp. Solitude reached new intensity. The navigator's mind moved beyond the perception of crew or officers, beyond the immediate currents, into the web of possibilities stretching across star systems. The burden of knowledge was profound. He saw hints of disaster, glimpses of salvation, and threads that linked both to human choices and to forces beyond comprehension. Conversation was no longer merely impractical. It was impossible. No mortal could share the immediacy of insight, the weight of anticipation, or the precise perception of the currents themselves. Solitude became both shield and crucible, a space in which focus sharpened, perception deepened, and judgment was honed against the Immaterium's constant, indifferent whisper. Through repeated communion with these fragments, the navigator began to understand the tenuous nature of his role. Influence was not control. Guidance was never absolute. The currents were patient, eternal, and indifferent, and the whispers provided insight only where humility, discipline, and attentiveness permitted. He could align fleets, anticipate disasters, and preserve lives, yet he knew that certainty was an illusion. Every maneuver, every decision carried an element of unknowable risk, a reminder that mastery of the Immaterium was partial, contingent, and forever provisional. By the close of this stage, The Navigator had become an instrument of perception and influence, an eye through which fragments of the Emperor's vision could be glimpsed, interpreted, and acted upon. He carried the weight of fleets, the safety of convoys, and the faint shimmering patterns of a cosmic order whose totality no mortal could grasp. Survival, insight, and prudence had merged into a singular consciousness capable of steering not only vessel and fleet, but human destiny itself, within the fragile lattice of warp currents and imperial design. And yet, even with mastery, the whispers persisted, reminding him that the universe remained vast, indifferent, and ever beyond the full reach of mortal understanding. The Navigator's perception now extended to threads of influence that spanned not just fleets, but entire sectors. Through the Immaterium, he sensed faint traces of political maneuvering, rivalries between planetary governors, and tensions within the Adeptus Astartes detachments, whose actions could alter the balance of war. Every ripple of decision, every subtle change in disposition, was embedded in the currents, and he learned to interpret them with care, knowing that human folly could amplify the smallest misjudgment into disaster. His mind became a prism through which the complexity of mortal ambition refracted into discernible patterns, guiding choices in real time, even when the participants themselves remained blind to the consequences. Ritual and meditation became increasingly intertwined with action. Each communion was now as much about strategy as it was about survival, a synthesis of psychic discipline and foresight that allowed him to influence outcomes across unimaginable distances. Tokens of the Emperor, inscriptions on data slates, and whispered prayers acted as focal points, stabilizing the currents and enabling him to thread multiple layers of perception simultaneously. Through this practice, the young Navigator gained the uncanny ability to anticipate moves in both the Immaterium and the material universe, glimpsing possibilities before they crystallized and steering events along trajectories that preserved life and mission integrity. Yet the stakes were never abstract. He had glimpsed the consequences of failure: fleets stranded in warp storms, convoys destroyed, entire worlds vulnerable to the predations of orcs, tyrannids, or renegade chaos fleets. The Immaterium did not care for innocence or intent. Only precision, discipline, and the subtle art of negotiation ensured survival. The Navigator understood that he was a fulcrum, and the universe, though vast and indifferent, could pivot upon his insight. One lapse, one error in judgment, could cascade across systems, imperiling lives that he had never seen, and perhaps would never know. These pressures, however, sharpened his vision. He began to perceive patterns that suggested the faintest glimpses of the Emperor's intent, echoes of strategy and will embedded in the Immaterium. The Astronomican's resonance, fragile yet persistent, became a subtle guide, a psychic thread woven into the currents that connected mortal perception to something eternal. Though no mortal could fully comprehend its totality, he recognized the fragments as pieces of a larger vision, an architecture of influence that spanned the galaxy. In these moments, he understood that his role was not only to navigate vessels, but to interpret and act upon glimpses of a vision so vast that even the most disciplined mind could only apprehend it in fragments. Danger remained omnipresent. The Immaterium was a patient teacher, testing both skill and resolve. Eddies could twist without warning, and whispers could deceive, offering guidance that was incomplete, partial, or intended to mislead. He learned to temper trust with skepticism, to balance intuition with ritual, and to integrate perception with prudence. Even the smallest miscalculation could result in psychic backlash, fleet misalignment, or mortal casualty. Mastery was not a guarantee of safety. It was a fragile equilibrium maintained through discipline, insight, and unwavering attention. In solitude, he reflected upon the immense weight of his role. Unlike other beings aboard the void ship, he bore not only immediate responsibility for navigation, but also the responsibility of mediating the interplay of human ambition, cosmic patterns, and fragments of the Emperor's intent. Every decision carried moral, strategic, and spiritual weight, a constant negotiation between the possible and the perilous. The burden was invisible yet palpable, pressing upon mind and body alike. Sleep offered only partial respite, for even in dreams, the currents whispered. The fragments flickered and the weight of choice persisted. By the close of this stage, the young Navigator had become a nexus of perception, influence, and prudence. He could trace the faintest currents, anticipate subtle disruptions, and act with precision upon the glimpses of a cosmic vision that few mortals could even perceive. The imperatives of survival, strategy, and interpretation had merged, forming a consciousness capable of steering the course of fleets, protecting worlds, and glimpsing patterns that spanned centuries and light years. And yet, with all mastery, he remained aware that the universe was vast, indifferent, and infinitely beyond complete understanding, a reminder that vigilance, humility, and discipline were eternal companions in his journey. The Navigator now moved with a certainty born of discipline and insight, yet tempered by the knowledge that certainty itself was fleeting. The Immaterium whispered constantly, its fragments of truth, rumor, and warning layered atop one another like overlapping waves. He perceived currents that carried echoes of past triumphs and failures, of fleets lost or preserved, of worlds burned or saved. Each ripple offered a lesson, a hint, a possibility. To act upon these whispers required judgment as precise as any calculation, and an awareness that interpretation was always partial. He could guide, advise, and intervene, but he could not bend fate to his will. The currents were patient, indifferent, eternal. Mastery was never more than temporary. Through this perception, he glimpsed the far-reaching implications of the Imperium's struggles. Fleets maneuvered across the void, planets braced against orc raids, the Adeptus Astartes undertook missions that spanned decades, and all movements intersected in patterns he could sense but never fully control. The Navigator's insight allowed him to thread his influence subtly, guiding vessels to avoid peril, anticipate enemy movements, and maintain cohesion across distances that would have overwhelmed any other mind. The interplay of the Immaterium and mortal decisions revealed the fragile lattice of survival, upon which countless lives depended. Each choice he made was a negotiation between chance and skill, instinct and knowledge, human intent, and the whispers of forces beyond comprehension. Solitude remained both a burden and a sanctuary. No mortal companion could share the immediacy of the currents, the delicate negotiation with whispering entities, or the responsibility of interpreting fragments of the Emperor's vision. Nights were filled with ritual and reflection, hands tracing sacred geometries over hollow displays, voices murmuring prayers, mind attuned to resonance and vibration. In this isolation, clarity emerged. The young Navigator learned to trust his perception without arrogance, to act decisively while remaining humble before the vastness of the Immaterium, and to integrate moral judgment with cosmic insight. He became a fulcrum of balance, a bridge between mortal and eternal perception and consequence. At times, the fragments hinted at mysteries even the most learned navigators dared not speak aloud. Rumors suggested that the Emperor's consciousness, whether wholly apotheosized, partially distributed, or manifested through the Astronomicon, wove subtle patterns into the Immaterium itself, guiding the fate of humanity. The young Navigator could not claim certainty, only perception. Faint alignments, echoes of will, and resonance within the warp that suggested a guiding hand beyond mortal comprehension. These glimpses were fragments, never whole, yet they were enough to imbue his decisions with a weight that transcended the immediate task of survival or navigation. Even as mastery grew, the Immaterium reminded him of its indifference. Anomalies, psychic turbulence, and the hidden malice of ancient entities tested vigilance relentlessly. Misreading a subtle current, ignoring a whisper, or acting impulsively could unravel all effort, leaving fleets stranded, convoys destroyed, or lives lost. The Navigator understood that skill, discipline, and perception were tools, not guarantees. Humility, patience, and unwavering attention were the only constants. The universe was indifferent, vast, and infinitely complex, and only by respecting its scale could he continue to act without calamity. The young Navigator had become fully realized in both ability and responsibility. He could interpret whispers, anticipate hazards, guide fleets, and perceive fragments of the Emperor's vision. Yet he remained conscious of the partial nature of all insight. Survival, mastery, and foresight had merged into a singular awareness capable of shaping the Imperium's course, even as he acknowledged the limits of mortal comprehension. The void ship was not merely a vessel, it was an extension of his consciousness, a lens through which mortal and cosmic forces intertwined, and a medium through which the imperatives of human and eternal could converge. In the stillness of the final meditation, he contemplated the immensity of his role. The currents whispered ceaselessly, carrying echoes of past and future, fragments of the Emperor's vision, and the faint pulse of the Astronomicon across uncountable light years. His insight allowed him to thread influence through fleets, fleets through currents, and currents through time, preserving life and shaping destiny without ever claiming ownership. He had become an eye beyond the stars, a sentinel of possibility, a negotiator of shadows and fragments alike. Mastery, he understood, was eternal vigilance, understanding partial and ephemeral, and the universe, in all its vast indifference, remained a challenge that could never be fully conquered, only respected, interpreted, and navigated.